Most people think this famous phrase from Jesus is simply about not judging others. But Joel Goldsmith revealed something far more profound that changes everything. This teaching holds the secret to your complete liberation from guilt, shame, and every form of spiritual bondage. What you are about to discover will shatter the foundation of human judgment forever. The woman caught in adultery stood before an angry mob ready to stone her to death. The religious authorities brought her to Jesus, confident they had trapped him. If he said stone her, he violated Roman law. If he said release her, he violated Jewish law. But Jesus did something that revealed the deepest mystery of consciousness itself. He bent down and wrote in the sand, then said those immortal words that echo through eternity. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. One by one, from the oldest to the youngest, every accuser dropped their stones and walked away. The scene became silent as the crowd dispersed into the dusty streets. But here is what Goldsmith wants you to understand about what really happened in that moment of divine revelation. This was not a lesson in tolerance or forgiveness as we commonly understand it. This was a transmission of cosmic consciousness that dissolved the very fabric of human judgment and revealed the nature of spiritual identity beyond all concepts of right and wrong. Jesus was not making a moral argument about hypocrisy or human weakness. He was revealing the fundamental nature of spiritual reality itself, the truth that exists before all human concepts arise. In that moment, he lifted every person present into a higher state of consciousness where judgment becomes impossible because separation itself is seen as the illusion it always was. He showed them that the very belief in sin is the only sin that exists in spiritual truth and authentic reality. Goldsmith taught that sin is not an action, but a state of consciousness that believes in separation from God. When you accept the reality of sin in another person, you accept it in yourself and in your entire world. You create the very prison you think you are judging from outside. When you judge another, you are really judging yourself and declaring your own spiritual imprisonment. You are declaring that you live in a world where imperfection exists, where God's creation can fail, where divine perfection can be broken or violated. This is the fundamental error of human consciousness that keeps us trapped in cycles of guilt and condemnation. The accusers dropped their stones not because they remembered their own moral failures and felt guilty. They dropped them because for one shining moment, Jesus lifted them into a consciousness where they saw the impossibility of sin itself. They glimpsed the truth that in God's kingdom there is no sin to punish because there is no separation to create it in the first place. Goldsmith taught that every time you judge another person, you are reinforcing the belief in a material world separated from God's presence. You are saying that God's creation is flawed, that divine perfection has gaps and failures. This belief is what creates every form of suffering you experience in your life, from illness to lack to broken relationships and emotional pain. The secret Jesus revealed is this transformative truth that changes everything when you truly grasp it. There is no sin in spiritual reality, only the mistaken belief in sin. There is no separation from God, only the illusion of separation. When you see another person as a sinner, you are seeing through the eyes of that illusion. You are trapped in material sense rather than spiritual vision. This is why judgment feels so heavy and burdensome to your soul and drains your energy completely. Every time you condemn another, you strengthen the very consciousness that condemns you. Every time you see imperfection in your brother, you bind yourself more tightly to the belief in your own imperfection. You create a mirror that reflects back your own deepest fears about yourself and your worthiness. The practice Goldsmith gives us is radical and immediate in its power to transform consciousness. When you are tempted to judge anyone for any reason, stop and recognize this truth. What I am seeing is not the spiritual reality of this person. I am seeing my own belief in separation made visible. I am seeing the one error that has no reality in God's presence and eternal mind. This practice dissolves judgment at its root cause and transforms your entire perception of reality within moments. You do not try to forgive the person or overlook their actions with effort. You recognize that in spiritual truth, there is nothing to forgive because there is no sin that ever occurred in reality. The person you see before you is God's perfect child, unchanged by any human action or belief. This is not positive thinking or denial of what appears to be happening in the material world before your eyes. This is spiritual vision, seeing with the eyes of Christ consciousness rather than human judgment. It is recognizing what is eternally true beyond all appearances, beyond all stories, beyond all concepts of right and wrong that humanity has created over thousands of years. When you practice this consistently over weeks and months, something miraculous begins to happen in your experience. The people in your life begin to reflect back the spiritual vision you are holding for them. Conflicts dissolve without confrontation. Relationships heal without difficult conversations. Your world begins to mirror the perfection you are recognizing in consciousness rather than perpetuating the cycle of judgment. But more importantly, you begin to experience your own liberation from guilt and self-condemnation that may have haunted you for years. When you stop believing in sin as a reality in others, you stop believing in it for yourself. The stones you were throwing at others were always the same stones you were throwing at your own heart. Let them drop now and walk in the freedom that has always been yours. A woman named Sarah came to one of Goldsmith's meditation circles carrying decades of shame and self-hatred that had become unbearable. She had made choices in her youth that her religious community never let her forget. Every Sunday she felt the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders like physical stones. She could barely look people in the eyes anymore, believing she deserved their condemnation. Goldsmith listened to her story with profound compassion, then asked her a question that stopped her tears instantly. Who is the person you are condemning? Is it God's creation, or is it a false image you have accepted about yourself? Sarah sat in confused silence, not understanding at first. He continued gently but firmly, leading her into deeper waters of understanding. The woman they judged, the woman you believe yourself to be, does not exist in spiritual reality, and never has. That identity is a fiction created by human judgment and material sense. Your true identity is the perfect, untarnished child of God, unchanged by any action you have ever taken or any thought you have ever had. This is not something you must become. It is what you have always been beneath the layers of false belief. Sarah began practicing this recognition daily, sometimes hourly, when the shame would rise in her consciousness like a dark wave. Within 3 months, something shifted so profoundly that her entire countenance changed. The weight lifted, not because she forgave herself through effort, but because she stopped believing in the reality of the self that needed forgiveness. She discovered her true spiritual identity, that judgment can never touch or diminish. A businessman named Michael struggled with constant judgment of his competitors, seeing them as dishonest and manipulative in every business dealing. This judgment was eating him alive with stress and anger. His blood pressure soared, his relationships suffered, and ironically, his business began to decline as his consciousness became consumed with what others were doing wrong in the marketplace. When he encountered Goldsmith's teaching on judgment, his first reaction was resistance and dismissal of the principle. How could he possibly see his competitors as sinless when they were clearly engaging in unethical practices that harmed others? Wasn't it his responsibility to call out wrongdoing and protect the innocent? This is the question most people ask when they first hear this radical teaching of spiritual vision. Goldsmith explained that recognizing spiritual perfection does not mean condoning harmful behavior in the material realm or ignoring injustice. It means understanding that the harmful behavior comes from a state of consciousness trapped in the belief of separation. When you see your competitor as a sinner, you strengthen that consciousness in them and in yourself. You become part of the problem rather than the solution that brings healing. Michael began the practice of seeing his competitors as spiritual beings trapped in false belief rather than evil people deserving punishment. He stopped mentally throwing stones at them in his mind throughout the day. Within 6 months, his entire business landscape transformed in ways he never could have predicted. 2 competitors reached out to collaborate. His stress disappeared. His business thrived not through combat, but through a consciousness of abundance and spiritual recognition that attracted greater success naturally. A mother named Rebecca carried unbearable guilt over her son's addiction that had destroyed their family peace for years. She blamed herself for every mistake she made in raising him, every moment she was too strict or too lenient. The weight of maternal guilt was crushing her spirit day by day. She could not sleep, could not find joy, could not see any path forward except endless self-punishment. A friend gave her Goldsmith's book on consciousness and the nature of spiritual identity versus material sense. When she read about the woman caught in adultery and Jesus' response, something cracked open in her awareness. She realized she had been throwing stones at herself for years, never allowing herself to drop them and walk away. She was both the accuser and the accused, trapped in a cycle of judgment with no escape. She began to practice seeing herself as God's perfect child, unchanged by any parenting mistake or human imperfection she believed she embodied. More importantly, she began to see her son not as an addict, but as a spiritual being temporarily trapped in material consciousness. She stopped condemning him in her thoughts, stopped rehearsing all his failures, stopped reinforcing the identity of brokenness she had been holding for him mentally. The transformation took almost a year of consistent practice, not overnight healing, but gradual awakening to truth. Her son did not immediately recover, but their relationship healed profoundly. And then, slowly, he began to respond to treatment that had failed before. Rebecca learned that when you stop holding someone in the consciousness of sin and failure, you release them to discover their true spiritual identity. You remove the invisible stones that your judgment had been throwing at them every day through your thoughts. A teacher named David realized he had been judging his difficult students with harsh mental condemnation daily for years. Every frustration, every behavioral problem, every failure to meet his expectations triggered intense judgment that exhausted him spiritually. He went home every day drained and bitter, wondering why he ever chose teaching as his profession in the first place. When he applied Goldsmith's principle of recognizing spiritual perfection instead of material imperfection, his classroom transformed in remarkable ways. The students he had labeled as troublemakers began to respond differently to him. They calmed down, paid attention, showed respect that he had been demanding but never receiving. He realized his judgment had been creating the very behavior he was condemning through an invisible but powerful mental atmosphere. This practice works not through magic but through the fundamental law of consciousness that Goldsmith taught throughout his life. What you hold in consciousness for another person, you help to make manifest in your shared experience. When you hold them in the consciousness of sin and failure, you reinforce that identity in them. When you recognize their spiritual perfection despite all appearances, you invite that truth to emerge through them into visible expression. The secret Jesus revealed in that ancient scene is available to you right now in this present moment. Every person you are tempted to judge is an opportunity to practice spiritual vision instead of material condemnation. Every stone you drop liberates not just them, but yourself from the prison of judgment. This is the path to freedom that has been hidden in plain sight for 2,000 years, waiting for you to discover it. If these transformation stories inspire you to practice spiritual vision, like this video to help others discover this freedom, subscribe for more Joel Goldsmith wisdom, and comment which story resonated most deeply with your own journey of releasing judgment and discovering your true spiritual identity. Goldsmith gave us a specific meditation practice to deepen this recognition of spiritual perfection beyond material appearances and human judgment. When you sit in silence each morning, bring to mind someone you have been judging recently. See their face clearly in your consciousness. Feel the judgment and condemnation you have been holding toward them, acknowledging it honestly without adding more judgment about having judgment in the first place. Now speak this truth silently to their spiritual essence beyond their human personality and actions. You are not what I have been seeing with material eyes and human judgment. You are God's perfect child, untouched by any action, unchanged by any mistake, unblemished by any sin I have projected onto you. The person I have been condemning is not your true identity, but a false image I created from my own consciousness of separation and fear. Hold this recognition for 5 to 10 minutes, not as a technique to change them, but as a practice to align your consciousness with spiritual truth instead of material illusion. Do not try to feel loving or forgiving through effort. Simply recognize what is true beyond all appearances, what has always been true, what will always be true, regardless of any material circumstance or human behavior you have witnessed. At first, this practice may feel mechanical or insincere, like you are lying to yourself about obvious reality. This resistance is normal and part of the process of spiritual awakening. You have spent years, perhaps decades, strengthening the habit of material judgment. The spiritual vision requires patience and consistent practice to develop. Within 2 to 3 weeks of daily practice, you will notice a subtle shift in how you perceive others and yourself in everyday interactions. Another powerful technique Goldsmith taught is the practice of catching judgment the moment it arises in your thoughts throughout your day. You cannot prevent the first automatic judgment that appears when someone cuts you off in traffic or says something hurtful, but you can catch that judgment within seconds and transform it through spiritual recognition rather than allowing it to take root and grow in your consciousness. The moment you notice judgment arising, mentally say this transformative phrase that interrupts the pattern immediately. This is not truth, this is material sense speaking. The spiritual reality of this person is God's perfect creation, and I choose to see with spiritual vision rather than human condemnation. Nothing they have done changes what they are in divine reality and eternal truth. This interruption of the judgment pattern is more powerful than you might initially recognize from hearing about it. Each time you catch judgment and replace it with spiritual recognition, you weaken the neural pathways of condemnation and strengthen the pathways of spiritual vision. You are literally rewiring your brain to see with Christ consciousness rather than material sense, creating new patterns of perception that become more automatic over time. Goldsmith emphasized that this is not about achieving perfection in never judging anyone ever again, which would itself become another form of self-condemnation. This is about consistent practice that gradually shifts your dominant state of consciousness from judgment to recognition. Some days you will catch yourself a dozen times. Other days you will forget and slip back into old patterns. Both are part of the journey toward spiritual awakening and liberation from the tyranny of judgment. A third technique involves working with self-judgment, which is often the deepest and most painful form of condemnation we carry daily. Every time you catch yourself engaging in negative self-talk or rehearsing your failures and mistakes mentally, stop immediately. Recognize that you are throwing stones at your own spiritual identity, denying your true nature as God's perfect expression manifested in form. Place your hand on your heart and speak this truth directly to yourself with gentle firmness and divine compassion. I am not this false image of failure and imperfection that human judgment has created. I am the untarnished child of God, perfect and complete in this present moment. All mistakes exist only in material sense and have no reality in spiritual truth. I release the stones I have been throwing at myself for years and decades. This practice of self-recognition is foundational to being able to recognize others spiritually without hypocrisy or pretense clouding your vision. If you secretly believe in your own sinfulness, you cannot genuinely see others as sinless without creating internal conflict. The liberation must begin with yourself, with dropping the stones you aim at your own heart, before you can help others drop theirs and walk in freedom. Many people find this self-recognition practice the most difficult of all the techniques Goldsmith taught throughout his ministry. We have been conditioned to believe that harsh self-judgment keeps us humble and motivated to improve ourselves. But Goldsmith revealed that self-condemnation is the opposite of humility. It is spiritual arrogance, claiming that you know better than God what you are. True humility is accepting your spiritual perfection as God's creation, rather than insisting on your own flawed assessment of yourself based on material appearances. The final complementary technique is the practice of blessing those who judge you harshly and seem to throw stones at your character. When someone criticizes you, condemns you, or treats you with contempt, your first human impulse is to defend yourself or attack back. But Goldsmith taught a radically different response that transforms both you and your accuser through spiritual recognition rather than human combat. Silently recognize this profound truth about the person condemning you without trying to explain it to them or convert them to your understanding. This person is not my enemy, but a child of God trapped in the consciousness of judgment and separation. They are throwing stones because they believe in sin as reality. I release them to discover their true spiritual nature. I see them as God sees them, perfect and whole beyond this moment of human darkness and confused perception. This practice does not mean you remain in abusive situations or allow others to harm you without appropriate boundaries and self-protection. Spiritual recognition and practical wisdom work together, not in opposition. You can remove yourself from harmful people while still holding them in the consciousness of their spiritual perfection, rather than condemning them as evil sinners who deserve punishment. These two actions are completely compatible and often necessary. When you bless those who curse you by recognizing their spiritual identity, you free yourself from the prison of resentment and victimhood that destroys your peace. You are no longer controlled by their judgment because you recognize it has no power to change what you are in spiritual truth. Their stones fall harmlessly to the ground because you are standing in a dimension of consciousness where stones cannot reach. This is the freedom Jesus demonstrated and invites you to experience in every moment of your existence on this earth. The most common obstacle people encounter with this practice is the feeling that recognizing spiritual perfection means ignoring genuine harm and allowing injustice to continue unchecked in the world. A woman named Patricia struggled with this exact conflict. Her sister had stolen money from their elderly mother repeatedly. How could Patricia possibly see her sister as perfect when she was clearly acting with selfish cruelty and criminal intent? Goldsmith would gently but firmly address this confusion that stops many people from practicing spiritual vision effectively. You are confusing two completely different levels of experience and mixing them together in your mind. On the material level, your sister has taken actions that require practical response, perhaps legal intervention, certainly firm boundaries to protect your mother. You address these practical matters with wisdom and appropriate action in the material realm where they occur. But simultaneously on the spiritual level, you recognize that your sister's actions come from a consciousness of separation and lack, not from her true spiritual identity. When you hold her in the consciousness of being a thief and a sinner, you strengthen that false identity and make transformation more difficult. When you recognize her spiritual perfection while still taking practical protective action, you create a consciousness that invites healing rather than reinforcing condemnation and separation. This dual recognition takes practice to maintain, because we are conditioned to believe that seeing someone's spiritual perfection means we must condone or overlook their harmful behavior in the material dimension. These are not contradictory positions but complementary levels of understanding. You can firmly stop harmful behavior while simultaneously seeing beyond it to the spiritual truth that remains unchanged by material actions and human mistakes. Another major challenge is the feeling of being inauthentic or dishonest when you try to see someone as spiritually perfect, while you can clearly observe their material imperfections and harmful patterns. A man named Robert said it felt like he was lying to himself, denying obvious reality, engaging in spiritual bypass that ignored genuine problems needing honest acknowledgement and confrontation. This is where Goldsmith's teaching becomes subtle and requires deeper understanding of the nature of reality itself. You are not denying what appears to be happening on the material level of experience. You are recognizing that the material level is not the deepest level of truth or the ultimate reality of anyone's being. The spiritual dimension is more real, more fundamental, more true than the material dimension that your physical senses report to your conscious awareness. Think of it this way that makes the principle clear and practical. When you look at a movie screen, you see characters acting, suffering, making mistakes, harming others within the story being projected. You can fully engage with the story and its moral complexities while simultaneously knowing that the characters are not ultimately real. They are projections of light and shadow. The screen itself remains pure and unblemished beneath all the drama playing out upon its surface. In the same way, you can engage fully with the material dimension of life, addressing its challenges and problems with practical wisdom, while simultaneously recognizing the spiritual truth that remains unchanged beneath all material appearances. This is not lying or denial, but seeing with double vision, material and spiritual at once. Over time, usually several months of consistent practice, this dual recognition becomes natural rather than forced or artificial in your daily experience. A third major obstacle is the resurgence of judgment after you thought you had overcome it through spiritual practice and dedication. Mark practiced Goldsmith's technique faithfully for 2 months and experienced profound peace and transformation. Then one day, someone betrayed him in business, and he found himself consumed with rage and harsh condemnation. He felt like a failure at spiritual practice, like all his progress had been erased in one moment of intense human emotion. Goldsmith would remind us that spiritual growth is not linear, but moves in cycles and spirals that include setbacks. The fact that judgment returned with such force does not mean your practice was worthless or that you have failed spiritually. It means you encountered a situation that triggered deeper layers of consciousness, still operating on the level of material sense and separation from divine wholeness. The key is not to judge yourself for judging, which creates an infinite loop of condemnation and spiritual paralysis. Instead, simply notice what happened with compassionate awareness. Ah, I slipped back into judgment consciousness. This shows me there is deeper work to do. Now I return to the practice of recognizing spiritual truth beyond this appearance. Now I remember again who I really am and who this person really is beneath the surface drama. Each time you return to spiritual recognition after slipping into judgment, you strengthen your spiritual foundation significantly. You are not starting over from zero, but building resilience and depth. Think of it like building muscle through exercise. The resistance itself makes you stronger. The moments when judgment returns forcefully are opportunities to practice at a deeper level than you could access when everything was going smoothly and your practice felt easy. The fourth challenge is dealing with systemic injustice and collective evil that seems to demand moral judgment and righteous condemnation. How can you see spiritual perfection in those who commit atrocities, who oppress entire populations, who perpetuate structures of violence and exploitation? Doesn't spiritual recognition become complicity with evil if you refuse to call sin by its name and condemn wrongdoers publicly? This is perhaps the most difficult question Goldsmith's teaching raises for sincere spiritual seekers who care deeply about justice and human dignity. The answer requires holding tremendous spiritual maturity and nuanced understanding. You can and must oppose harmful systems and protect vulnerable people with all your strength and resources. You can fight injustice passionately while still recognizing that even the oppressor is ultimately a spiritual being trapped in the deepest darkness of separation consciousness. Your opposition to evil becomes more effective, not less, when it comes from spiritual recognition rather than personal hatred. When you fight injustice from a consciousness of condemning sinners, you perpetuate the very consciousness of separation that created the injustice in the first place. When you fight from a recognition that all beings are children of God, trapped in varying degrees of material illusion, you bring a healing consciousness that can genuinely transform rather than simply rearranging power dynamics. This does not mean you love everyone's behavior or condone harmful actions with passive acceptance. It means you recognize the spiritual truth beneath the material appearance while still taking strong action to stop harm and protect the innocent. Jesus demonstrated this perfectly. He overturned the tables of money changers in the temple with righteous anger while simultaneously recognizing the spiritual perfection of every person present. These are not contradictory but complementary expressions of divine love in action. If these challenge-breaking insights are helping you navigate the complexities of spiritual practice in real life, like this video to support others finding this wisdom, subscribe for more advanced Joel Goldsmith teachings, and comment which obstacle you are currently working to transform through spiritual recognition and practical application. A physician named Dr. Elizabeth spent 30 years in emergency medicine, seeing the worst of human suffering and violence daily. Trauma victims, overdose cases, gunshot wounds, abuse victims. How could she possibly maintain spiritual recognition when confronted with such overwhelming evidence of human darkness and the reality of evil actions that destroyed innocent lives and families? She discovered Goldsmith's teaching during a period of severe burnout when she was considering leaving medicine entirely. The practice transformed her relationship to her work in ways she never anticipated. She began to see each patient not as their diagnosis or their wounds, but as a spiritual being having a material experience that did not touch their true identity. This shift did not make her less competent medically, but more present and effective. She noticed that patients responded to her differently when she held them in this consciousness of spiritual wholeness while treating their material conditions. Difficult patients calmed down inexplicably. Healing seemed to progress more smoothly than statistics predicted. She was not performing miracles, but creating a consciousness in her presence that invited healing rather than reinforcing the identity of sickness and brokenness. After 5 years of this practice, Dr. Elizabeth says she sees her work completely differently now. She is not just treating bodies, but holding a space of spiritual truth in a place where material sense dominates overwhelmingly. She still experiences the normal emotions of grief and frustration, But underneath them is a foundation of knowing that cannot be shaken by material appearances. She has become a practitioner of consciousness as well as a physician of the body, serving her patients on multiple dimensions simultaneously. A prison chaplain named Father Michael worked with violent offenders, many serving life sentences for horrific crimes that would shock most people's conscience. He struggled deeply with how to minister to these men, while his own human consciousness recoiled from their actions with instinctive moral judgment and revulsion. How could he offer genuine spiritual guidance while secretly condemning them as irredeemable sinners? He encountered Goldsmith's interpretation of the woman caught in adultery during a crisis of faith. He realized he had been standing with the stones in his hands his entire ministry, never truly dropping them despite his role as a spiritual guide. He had been offering religious comfort while withholding spiritual recognition, giving them God's forgiveness theoretically while denying their spiritual perfection in his consciousness. He began practicing seeing each inmate as God's child trapped in the deepest darkness of separation consciousness rather than as evil men who deserved eternal condemnation. He stopped mentally rehearsing their crimes before meeting with them. He held them in consciousness as spiritual beings capable of awakening regardless of what their material history contained or what society's judgment declared about their worth and future. The transformation in his ministry was profound and undeniable over the following 3 years of dedicated practice. Men who had been hardened and resistant began to open up spiritually. Several experienced genuine transformation that even prison staff noticed and commented on. Father Michael learned that everyone, regardless of their material actions, is seeking the same thing: recognition of their true spiritual identity beneath the false self they have been living from. When you offer that recognition, healing becomes possible where it seemed impossible before. A mother named Jennifer faced perhaps the most difficult situation. Her teenage daughter was destroying her life through addiction and dangerous choices that terrified Jennifer daily. Every parent's nightmare. Every intervention failed. Every attempt to help was rejected with hostility and manipulation. Jennifer lived in constant fear and anguish, oscillating between rage and despair, unable to find any peace or path forward. A counselor introduced her to Goldsmith's teaching with the gentle warning that this practice would challenge everything Jennifer believed about helping her daughter. Jennifer was desperate enough to try anything. She began the painful practice of seeing her daughter not as an addict, not as a troubled teen, not as her daughter's destructive behavior, but as a spiritual being temporarily lost in material consciousness and false identity. This practice did not come easily or naturally to Jennifer. For months, she struggled to maintain spiritual recognition while watching her daughter's life spiral downward materially. The temptation to condemn, to judge, to throw stones in her mind was overwhelming every single day. But she persisted with the practice, supported by a spiritual study group that understood Goldsmith's principles and could hold her accountable. After 18 months, her daughter hit rock bottom and finally accepted help seriously for the first time. During recovery, her daughter told Jennifer something remarkable. She said that in her darkest moments, she felt like Jennifer was the only person who still saw something good in her, even when Jennifer was setting firm boundaries and refusing to enable the addiction. Jennifer had been holding her daughter in spiritual consciousness even while taking tough practical action. Both were necessary. Both worked together to create the possibility of healing that emerged gradually over years, not overnight, but genuinely and sustainably over time. An activist named Marcus worked for racial justice and spent his days confronting systems of oppression and discrimination that harmed his community systematically. He was angry, righteously so, and his anger fueled his work for years. But over time he noticed the anger was consuming him from within, creating bitterness that affected his relationships and his health. The very hatred he felt for oppressors was becoming its own form of bondage. When he encountered Goldsmith's teaching on judgment, his first reaction was rejection and intellectual dismissal. This sounded like spiritual bypassing that ignored real evil and excused oppressors from accountability for systemic harm. How could he possibly see spiritual perfection in those who perpetuated racist systems that destroyed lives daily? Wasn't his judgment righteous and necessary for justice to prevail? But gradually, he began to understand the subtle distinction Goldsmith was making between levels of consciousness and dimensions of reality. He could fight oppressive systems with all his strength while recognizing that even the oppressors were spiritual beings trapped in the consciousness of separation and fear. His opposition to injustice did not require him to hate the human beings perpetuating it. In fact, his hatred was making him less effective, clouding his judgment, narrowing his vision of what was possible. As Marcus integrated this practice into his activist work over several years, he became more powerful, not less, in fighting for justice and systemic change. He could now sit across from opponents and see their humanity while still firmly opposing their actions and policies. He could negotiate from a place of spiritual strength rather than reactive anger. He found that people were more likely to actually change when he approached them from recognition rather than condemnation. His work became more sustainable because he was no longer burning himself out with hatred that consumed his peace. He discovered that spiritual vision and social justice are not enemies but powerful allies in creating genuine transformation in the world. Now you understand why Jesus' words go far deeper than a simple lesson about hypocrisy or mercy in human relationships. He was revealing the fundamental nature of consciousness itself and how it creates or dissolves the entire world of suffering you experience. Every stone you throw at another person, you throw at yourself. Every judgment you release for your own liberation simultaneously. The practice of spiritual recognition is not easy, especially in the beginning when it feels forced and unnatural. You will fail repeatedly. You will slip back into judgment dozens of times each day. You will question whether this practice makes any real difference in the harsh material world where suffering appears so devastatingly real and unavoidable. This is all part of the journey toward spiritual awakening and liberation. But if you persist with this practice for 6 months to a year, you will notice a transformation in your consciousness that changes everything you experience. The world does not necessarily change externally, though often it does in surprising ways, but your perception transforms completely. You begin to see with spiritual vision as your default awareness, rather than as a technique you occasionally remember to apply when convenient. You will find yourself naturally seeing people's spiritual essence first, their material behavior second. Judgment will still arise, but you will catch it more quickly and release it more easily. The stones will feel heavier in your hands, and you will drop them more willingly. The burden of condemnation will lift from your shoulders, and you will walk in a freedom you perhaps have never known in your entire life until now. This is the freedom Jesus offered the woman caught in adultery, when everyone else offered only stones and death. He saw what she truly was beneath the appearance of sin and material transgression. He held her in the consciousness of spiritual perfection, and that recognition gave her the opportunity to discover her true identity beyond the false self she had been living from in darkness and separation. Notice that Jesus did not lecture her about morality or make her promise to be good in the future. He simply said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." He was not commanding her to stop sinning through willpower and effort. He was revealing that sin has no reality in spiritual truth. When you know who you truly are, you cannot sin because sin requires the belief in separation from God that you no longer hold in consciousness. This is the transformation available to you right now in this present moment, not through years of religious discipline or moral effort, but through the simple recognition of spiritual truth beyond material appearance. You are not the sinner you have believed yourself to be. You are not the collection of mistakes and failures that human judgment has defined as your identity over years and decades. You are God's perfect child, untouched by any material experience, unchanged by any action, unblemished by any thought or deed. This is not something you must achieve through effort and striving. This is what you are, what you have always been, what you will always be. The practice is simply remembering this truth and living from it more consistently until it becomes your natural state of consciousness and perception. Goldsmith spent his life teaching this one fundamental principle in countless forms and applications across all areas of human experience. The entire material world with all its suffering, limitation, conflict, and death is the product of consciousness operating from the belief in separation from God. When that belief is released, the material world does not necessarily disappear, but your experience of it transforms completely and miraculously. This is not magical thinking or denial of reality, as some critics claim when encountering these teachings superficially. This is the deepest metaphysical truth that mystics have discovered across all traditions and cultures throughout human history. What you hold in consciousness, you experience in manifestation. What you believe to be true about yourself and others becomes your lived reality through invisible but powerful laws of spiritual causation. When you practice seeing spiritual perfection instead of material imperfection, you are not pretending or lying to yourself about obvious facts and difficult circumstances. You are choosing to align your consciousness with a deeper truth that exists beyond the material appearance visible to physical senses. You are choosing to see with spiritual vision rather than material sense, with Christ consciousness rather than human judgment and limitation. The stones in your hands right now represent every judgment you are holding against yourself and others, every condemnation, every criticism, every belief in sin and separation and unworthiness. Jesus is standing before you today, asking the same question he asked 2,000 years ago. Who among you is without sin? Let that person cast the first stone. Can you hear the invitation in his words? Can you feel the stones growing heavier in your hands as spiritual truth penetrates your awareness? Drop the stones now and walk away from the consciousness of judgment that has imprisoned you for so long. You do not need to carry them anymore. You do not need to punish yourself or others for being human, for making mistakes, for falling short of impossible standards that no one can meet in material consciousness. The liberation you seek is not somewhere in the future after years of spiritual practice and discipline. It is here now, available in this present moment through simple recognition of spiritual truth beyond material appearance. You are forgiven because there was never anything to forgive. You are perfect because God's creation cannot be imperfect, regardless of material appearances. You are free because the prison of judgment was always made of thoughts you can release right now, simply by choosing spiritual vision over material condemnation. This is the secret Jesus revealed in that dusty street 2,000 years ago, and it is as powerful and transformative today as it was then for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. The woman walked away free not because Jesus performed a miracle, but because he held her in the consciousness of who she truly was, until she could recognize it for herself and live from that truth permanently. You can walk away free today from every stone you have been carrying, every judgment you have been holding, every condemnation that has weighed down your spirit and robbed you of peace. The path is clear before you. The practice is simple, though not always easy. The transformation is available to anyone willing to see with spiritual vision rather than material sense. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone, or drop them all now and discover the freedom that has always been yours in spiritual truth and divine reality. If your spiritual understanding has expanded through these Joel Goldsmith secrets, and you feel ready to walk in freedom from judgment, like this video to help others discover this liberation. Subscribe for more transformative consciousness teachings, and comment, "I am transformed," to confirm your commitment to this new path of spiritual vision and healing recognition that changes everything.